Liz Truss, welcome to GB News. First of all, you're flying up to Balmoral Castle. How involved were you in discussions to be appointed at Balmoral Castle rather than traditionally at Buckingham Palace because of the Queen's health?
Well, the discussions have been going on for several days. I'd just been elected as leader of the Conservative Party, and we were hearing rumours, and I discussed it with the Cabinet Secretary when the decision came through to have the meeting at Balmoral. And clearly it was about the Queen's health being in a difficult position.
Because there were reports that the Queen was pretty insistent that it's her job to do it, and she wasn't going to perhaps allow the then Prince Charles to stand in her place. She was determined to carry out her duties to the end.
Well, she absolutely was. And in fact, the meeting at Balmoral, she was absolutely on top of what was happening. She was very, very keen to reassure me that we'd be meeting again soon. So absolutely, it was very important to her.
What were your first impressions of Her Majesty when you walked into that drawing room?
Well, I met the Queen before when I was Justice Secretary, so I've met her on several occasions. And although she was physically quite frail, she was absolutely mentally alert and determined to do her duty. And
you said that she told you that we would meet again soon, so presumably there was no indication then that Her Majesty was gravely ill.
No, and I was obviously in the first few days of the job of being Prime Minister, I was thinking about many different things. But the assumption absolutely was that this would be the first of many meetings.
Yeah, of course, because that famous photograph now of you meeting Her Majesty in that room turned out to be the last photograph of her. What did she say to you? I know you can't talk about specifics, of course, but was it a relatively upbeat meeting? She didn't seem tired at all.
Well, she was very determined to do her duty and right to the end. And, we had a very, very good meeting, and she was, yes, upbeat.
Can you remember the last thing she said to you?
Well, not exactly, no.
Okay, fair enough. So on the 7th of September, there was a Privy Council meeting in the Cabinet Office. I spoke to Nadeem Zahawi yesterday, actually, and he told me that it originally was going to be a video call, then that turned into a phone call, and then it was postponed. Were you given any special indication that Her Majesty's health had taken a turn for the worse on that day?
Well, so I arrived quite just before 6 p.m. for the meeting, and everybody was there sort of waiting around, and we waited for a few minutes, and then the news arrived that the Queen would no longer be able to do the meeting. And that was the first I heard of it, but clearly it was a very ominous sign.
Yeah, and you said you'd only been in the job at that point just over a day. How prepared were you for Operation London Bridge, and were you given any specific briefings over those 2 days?
So yes, I was given briefings, and of course I'd been aware of the programme in the previous roles that I'd done. So, for example, when I was Lord Chancellor has a major role in it. So I understood what was happening, but there's a big difference between a plan written on the page and then the thing that we didn't want to happening.
Did your mind go back at all to that final meeting you had with her at Balmoral and how she appeared in person, her being able to lean on her walking stick, sitting down, stood up, things like that?
I mean, what happened is over the course of those few days, the news just kept getting worse. So at Balmoral, she was in good spirits. There was then the Privy Council that didn't happen. And the next day, of course, things were clearly getting even worse the next day. So it was a dawning realization, I think, not just of me and my colleagues that we were facing.
Sure. Well, let's move on to the 8th of September, that day. When were you first told that Her Majesty the Queen was dying? There's been reports that Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, asked to see you privately. You were preparing at the time for your energy plan announcement in the Commons. So just talk me through what happened that morning.
I mean, as I've said, the news was getting worse, and it was clear that we were talking about days rather than weeks. That's what I recollect. And it was when I was in the Commons chamber, having just given the opening remarks in the debate about the energy package, that Nadhim Zahawi came in with a note, and essentially were indicating things were getting worse.
So to be clear, when you went into the Commons, you were not aware that Her Majesty was dying at that point?
I knew that she was seriously ill. I think I didn't know how imminent the end was. That was the situation.
Okay.
But by then, I obviously headed back to number 10, and the news was getting worse and worse.
I see. So when Nadhim Zahawi came in to hand you the notes, he was telling me yesterday that it was almost like an agreed statement that you would read out in the Commons should the palace release a statement at 11:15, which was the original plan, to say that doctors were concerned for Her Majesty's health. Is that your recollection? Because it's now very famous, isn't it? Nadhim Zahawi and yourself on the front bench in quite serious discussions.
Yes, that's mine.
So that's
recollection.
That's your recollection. And what did you say to Nadhim Zahawi on the front bench?
Well, I just expressed concern, and then I think pretty soon after that, had to head out to deal with the issue.
So you headed back to Downing Street, and what was it like over those next few hours? Were you up in your Downing Street flat, trying to write your speech that you would address to the nation should the terrible news come?
Well, I was thinking about that. I had various other issues to deal with as well at the time, and really just waiting for the news. But I think by that point we knew it was very, very serious.
So, I mean, you'd only been in Downing Street a couple of days. Had you even moved in your wardrobe, for example? Is it right that an aide had to go and collect a black dress for you?
It is right that somebody had to go and collect my dress from my house, and we had moved some of our stuff in at that point, but the job was very new, and I think in those situations you just have to deal with what's in front of you. And I knew I would have to address the nation. I knew the situation was very, very serious, and it was really just getting through those crucial moments and making sure that we did all we could to pay tribute to the Queen, but also to make sure there was a smooth transition, to support the new King. Those were all the thoughts going through my head, along with all the other 100,000 things you're thinking about as a new Prime Minister.
Of course. And what time were you told that Her Majesty had passed away?
I'd probably have to look up what the time was. It was later on in the afternoon.
So a couple of hours before the public
Yes.
announcement.
Yes.
And what was going through your mind? What was that moment like? Because it's pretty monumental, right?
Well, we were in the Downing Street flat with officials, other people. So when the news came through, it was sort of confirming all the worst fears that we'd had.
And how did you feel personally?
So I feel very, very sad about the situation, but also just, knowing that I would have to deal with it. Part of your brain is thinking, my goodness me, this is a momentous occasion. Our Queen, who's been on the throne for 70 years, the absolute backdrop to our lives is now gone. But also, I tend to focus on the practical in those type of moments and just thinking, right, I need to make sure my speech is ready. I need to make sure the right people are informed. I need to make sure that, the cabinet ministers responsible for organising what was going to be a massive international occasion. So all of those thoughts are going through your head.
Yeah, and it's getting on with the job, isn't it? And the speech itself, had there been a draft prepared already, and did you perhaps tweak it to a more modern 21st century audience? I think there's one report saying that a civil servant gave a draft which appeared as if it had been written in the 1960s. Is that?
Well, I wanted to say it in my own words. So I drafted it with a speechwriter to say what I felt in my own words.
Did you speak to the King that day, or was your first, you did, on the 8th of September?
I did.
On the telephone?
Yes.
And what was that discussion, what were those discussions about?
Well, I offered my sincere condolences, and, it was a very short discussion that I offered my condolences.
And how did he seem?
Well, very, very resolute.
Yes, and then you met him in Buckingham Palace the next day. And did you get a sense that he was prepared for the role?
Absolutely. And again, I met him on several occasions before. And he is somebody who does his duty. And, there had been a lot of preparations, of course there had.
And was there big differences between His Majesty and Her late Majesty, or did you see a similarity between them as monarchs?
I don't think I saw enough of the Queen, frankly, to be able to make that judgment. I mean, she is somebody who had been on the throne for many, many years. And as I've said, it was such a part of our national life. We just celebrated the Platinum Jubilee. And King Charles is somebody who'd also been a very prominent part of British life. And I think we've seen the continuity.
And you obviously had to sign the proclamation during the Accession Council, and you spent a lot of time with His Majesty over those 10 days, travelling to various parts of the UK. How do you think he handled it? And were there any private moments, perhaps, that you reflected on the monumental occasion that it was, the passing of one monarch and the dawn of a new age?
Well, I think because both of us were stepped into new roles, a lot of what you're thinking about is the practicalities of getting things done. But occasionally, yes, of course, you think, goodness me, this is such a huge moment when the crowds were lined up everywhere we went, whether it was Edinburgh, Belfast, Cardiff, crowds of people on the street, the coffin arriving in London. I remember that was very poignant, just to think that, this really was, the end of such an important era.
Quite emotional
such an important person.
Quite
Absolutely.
emotional then, yeah. Did you get a chance to speak to the Prince of Wales or the Queen Consorts, Queen Camilla, during that time, at the Accession Council, for example?
At the Accession Council, it was all very organised and scripted. So I was gathered with the bishops, the Archbishop, and it was really, I think, at the Buckingham Palace reception where we had the international leaders that I spoke to. I spoke to people, which was later on.
I see. And what were those conversations about? Was it about the Queen, or were you looking to the future?
A bit of both, of course, a bit of both.
As I said, you've seen the King a lot over those 10 days, and then you had, I suppose, your first weekly audience with him in October, where he kind of made a joke back again, oh dear, and there was a lot of speculation as to what the King meant by that. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think it might have been my third visit to Buckingham Palace that day, because we'd had a Privy Council meeting earlier, so I think he was talking about my frequent visits.
I see. So a joke more than anything else.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I see. And just finally, thinking about this past year, what do you think Her Majesty the Queen's legacy is or will be?
Well, I think she was such a major figure, not just for Britain, but for the whole post-war era. And she represents that continuity and that huge hope people had for the future after what was a terrible war, an era of peace and prosperity. And I think she represented that. And just in terms of, is one of the main things people ask me is, how was she? You know, she's still very, very loved and treasured.
And she was still very much with us until the end.
Absolutely. And that's what just struck me about her, is right until that moment, she wanted to be there doing her duty.
Liz Truss, thank you very much for
Thank
speaking
you.
to me.